So my name is Greg Street. I head design on League of Legends. Players call me Ghost Crawler. They call me worse things as well, but we'll get to that. I've been asked to remind you about keeping an eye on your phones and filling out the review forms at the end of the session. And here we go. So I want to start by explaining the title, Balancing League for Every Player from Bronze to Bengi. This is Bronze. Within ranked League of Legends, there are 7 tiers. Bronze is the first one. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, this is Bengi. His name is Bei Song-eung. He's currently the jungler for a Chinese eSports team named Vici, but he's better known as a 3-time world champion with Korean team SKT. He's very good at League of Legends. So this is the challenge. How do you balance a game where the skill differential between players isn't like 10% or 20%, it's 1,000%, 10,000%. The pros of League are exponentially better than people just starting out. And this is me. I started life as an oceanographer. That actually isn't me, but that's the kind of stuff I did, dropping muddy things off the back of boats. It was before digital cameras. I got my start in game design working on the Age of Empires franchise, where I was at Ensemble Studios for 10 years. From there, I went on to World of Warcraft, where I led systems design for about 6 years. And I've been at Riot Games working on League of Legends for the past 3 years. On all 3 of these franchises, I either oversaw balance directly or was accountable for it. I've been doing this a long time. I like to nerf things. I use a crab as my avatar, getting back to the marine theme. This is Ghost Crawler, this is Ghost Crawler, and more recently I've switched to the Rift Scuttler. And this is League of Legends. Hopefully most of you are familiar with this, and that's why you came, but just in case, it is a 5v5 MOBA, free to play with cosmetic content. We like to think of it looking like the image on the left, but of course it actually looks like the image on the right. I'm going to use a lot of League examples in the talk today, but not everything, and I'll mention some other games as well. My hope is that this topic is broadly applicable to the kind of games you guys work on and not just a story of League of Legends. And this is a champion. This is Leona the champion. League has 134 champions, so we add new ones every year. Champion is a unique character with a passive and 4 different abilities. We often abbreviate these abilities QWER, which I say because I'm going to end up calling them QWER. That's just our shorthand. I'm going to talk a lot about champion balance because champions are kind of the basic molecule by which players interact with League of Legends. So a lot of the balance considerations that we deal with are about champions. So my topic outline, why is balance important? I'm going to cover this super quickly because I'm going to make the assumption you guys are kind of on board with this concept already. How we balance for different skill levels, balance for a massive audience, and then finally, I'm going to spend the majority of the talk talking about how, tactically, how does Riot balance League day to day? And I'll try to end with plenty of time for questions. So, why is balance important? I like the definition that game balance is a contract with the player, because contract implies a business transaction where players are getting goods and services for their payment. And it could be literal payment if they're purchasing a character, but it doesn't have to be, real money. If you play a warlock in World of Warcraft, you may have 10 years invested in that character, and you want some guarantee that game balance isn't going to stop you from playing her. Now, League is a competitive PvP game. We have a very, very small PvE component. And skill in League is supposed to matter. This is why players play League of Legends, to demonstrate their skill. And we don't ever want the state of balance to trump skill. When you have a game that's imbalanced, it makes it too easy to solve the game. And if you have a game that is very solvable, players tend to get bored. And when players tend to get bored, they stop playing your game. Options are also really good for longevity. If you have a game like League that we hope that players interact with for a long time, once they get tired of playing one champion, there's a lot of other ones out there that they can try out. Now, Riot as a company cares a lot about player trust. This is something we focus on a lot. We try to be very player-focused in every decision we make. And if the game is in an imbalanced state for too long, that kind of suggests to the players that we don't care. And so it's kind of violating, trying to hold up player trust as being so important. Now, tragically, balance is really hard. And as important as it is for your game and for players, the development cost is super high. And I'm going to talk throughout the rest of the talk about why this is and some strategies and tactics that may help you mitigate it. So balance for different skill levels, part 2. This is what a pro championship of League of Legends looks like. Pros can do amazing things that we mere mortals cannot possibly conceive of doing. And balance at high skill level, and especially at pro skill level, is really different from balance for the rest of the game, and certainly for newer players. And I'm going to talk about some of these differences that manifest in the game, in any game, that make it difficult to balance for extreme skill differentiation. So next few slides, I'm just coming at you with a list, be forewarned. Some of these are differences you don't want to avoid necessarily, but you do want to be aware of them. So to start off, you can break down player skills being tested in a game into a lot of different buckets. Things like good decision making, good team communication, fast reflexes, and so forth. Now, one of the biggest differences between highly skilled and normal skilled players comes in execution difficulty. As developers, we sometimes often balance the power of an ability with it being difficult for a player to pull off. So this is a basic skill shot. League of Legends is full of them. Rather than clicking on the enemy target with your mouse and then just hitting a button that will always hit them, you have to line up the attack and take into consideration things like, leading them, predicting where the enemy is going to be, and so forth. But it's not just skill shots. Anything involving timing or multitasking, or often just the speed of clicking, APM, is much easier for highly skilled players. Some of the ultimates in League of Legends, the R ability, are channeled. And a channeled ability, you could think of the champion as like winding up casting a spell. And during that time, if they get interrupted, it either cancels the spell outright or it might have a diminished effect. This is Fiddlesticks, our evil magical scarecrow. He has an ult called Crowstorm, where he summons a lot of crows, but he does have to channel it. And this is the kind of thing that makes it a little harder to use at the pro level or even at highly skilled players, because it will get interrupted. You have to keep in mind when you're talking about these, 1% of skilled players, anything whose cost is easy to interrupt is going to be interrupted. And anything whose cost is hard to pull off, they will pull off. It's not just feats of dexterity, though. Skilled players understand the higher level strategies of the game as well. They can pull from a lot of knowledge, including knowing strengths and weaknesses of champions almost reflexively. This is Garen. He is very powerful at the lower tiers of League of Legends and not so successful at the higher tiers. He likes to hide in bushes and spin around in circles, which players call spin to win. It's very effective if you don't know how to get out of it. At higher level, you can crowd control him and it kind of shuts him down. We'll talk a little more about Garen in a minute. So going way back to my roots, the Age of Empires, this is one of the first balanced nemesis I ever faced. Two of the most powerful traits you can give a unit character champion are long range and fast movement. And the two together is amazing. Cavalry archers were the bane of my existence on Age of Empires. There's a reason the Mongols were so effective with them. You run up, you shoot, you run away. They're experts at kiting. It makes it very difficult for other units or other players to be able to catch up with them. And this extends to League of Legends. We have champions like Vayne and Lucian, who are highly mobile yet ranged. And skilled players who are great at micromanagement are going to be able to do a lot of damage with never having to take damage themselves. Now, this is an interesting one. Most League players experience the game solo. We have matchmaking. We'll find you a team, and we'll find you an enemy team. But organized play is a very different experience. And of course, anything professional is organized play. These guys play together all the time. They have plays. They can almost read each other's minds. You think of it like a buddy cop movie where the two cops enter a building and they immediately know to cover each other's blind spots. Low elo, on the other hand, because they don't have the guarantee that someone's going to help defend them, tend to gravitate more towards generalists. This cute critter here is Kog'Maw. He's a classic glass cannon. He can do a ton of damage at range, but if you get up in his face, he crumbles very quickly. And as you might imagine, it's difficult for players in solo queue to be able to effectively utilize him because they just don't know that their team's going to be there backing him up. Now, highly skilled players are really good at manipulating your economy, and getting an economic advantage in any game can often be really powerful. In League of Legends, we see this as gold funneling. So basically, in League, you kill things, you get gold, use the gold to buy more items to get powerful. And the idea is that everyone kind of rises in power as the game goes on, and more skilled players rise a little faster. But skilled players, we see this definitely with pros, can kind of have a lot of the team avoid getting gold to make sure that one player gets a lot of gold early. So they have this really powerful spike, and even though it's only one player on the team, they can leverage that to get an advantage. In World of Warcraft, we would see this with the high-end guilds when they would raid, would do things like, we're going to pass all the gear to the main tank or to a really important DPS character. And this got to the point of running alt raids where a group would run a raid, all the gear would go to one player while everyone else was on their alt, and they'd switch to the next player and so on using different raid instances. It's hard to stop, it's hard to design around that, but it makes balance very difficult for these high-end raiding guilds. AI-dependent power. We love to put turrets in our games. So here is Heimerdinger from League of Legends, Torbjorn from Overwatch, and the engineer from Team Fortress. The problem with AI power, and in this case the turrets, but it also could be like your character has a pet. AI power just doesn't scale really well with skill level. If you think of the power as a pie chart, the AI part of that power takes up a big part of that pie chart, and it doesn't really change depending on whether you're talking at low or high skill level. So as developers, we have to kind of choose where we're going to tune those turrets. And if we tune them to be very, very powerful at high end, they're just going to crush lower end players. On the other hand, if you do what most of us do and make them relatively reasonably fair at lower levels, at high levels, they're just not going to see them get much play. Strong windowed power. This is one of those cases where as developers, we often make the cost of like, yeah, we're going to give you a lot of power, but it's going to last for a really, really short period of time. The more skilled players won't waste that time. Even if it's a really small window, they can get a lot out of that. This wormy-looking monster here is Baron Nashor from League of Legends. When your team kills him, you get a buff to sieging the enemy base, which is a great way to shut down a game. And at high end, Baron absolutely decides whether a game is won or lost. But lower skilled players can easily waste this buff. They die, they don't get their group coordinated, the buff eventually ticks away before they're able to leverage it. In World of Warcraft, shamans have an ability called Bloodlust, which increases group haste for the entire group, and skilled teams are really good at uniting like all of their cooldowns to fire off at once, your trinkets, whatever your personal DPS or healing cooldowns are. And I'm sure this still happens. The groups will all line up and pop their cooldowns at once for a gigantic power spike, particularly at the start of the fight when everyone's still at 100%. Be really, really careful of your early game. This is a great opportunity for skilled players to get an advantage that later snowballs and makes them impossible to stop later on. This goes along with the cost of, but you might make a mistake, because the more skilled the players are, the less likely they are to make a mistake. Their gameplay really can kind of approach perfection. In regular play, someone has a chance to get back in, but at high skilled play, the game may be over as soon as someone gets a slight advantage early on. You see this in real-time strategy games too, like Age of Empires or StarCraft, where a small economic advantage earlier just pays lots and lots of dividends by the late game. So I've talked mostly about game design, but let's not forget, we're mostly talking about software running on hardware, and there are limitations. We recently did a study to look at play rates and win rates of certain league champions according to different ping rates, and we found that it's back. A place like Korea, which has a really good internet, actually allowed players to use different champions and have different win rates than maybe somewhere like the US, where everyone's bouncing off the same servers in Chicago. You can mitigate this a little bit by doing things like making sure there's a little bit of space, like instead of giving players a fraction of a second to execute a command, you can extend that to half a second or something like that, which may help overcome latency problems. So this is a pretty nuanced issue I'll try to walk through. Tactical errors at extreme peaks of skill tend to be really rare, which means that who wins can often come down to who makes a mistake first. Like, two teams are playing perfectly, somebody misclicks, and that is the entire game ending right there. It can be really exciting as a viewer, but you're kind of left with this hollow feeling that it really wasn't the more skilled team that won, it was just the person who didn't make a mistake. So my lesson here is make sure that you have high-level strategies that high-skilled players can exploit, as well as tactical considerations. By tactics, I'm talking about things like where you're positioning your character, when you're using your different abilities. High-level strategy is more about, do we want to have an early power advantage? Do we want to try to sneak in their base? Are we going to split lanes? Things like that. If you have higher-level strategy, the game won't just come down to misclicking. So I highlighted some of the differences in trying to balance for both highly skilled and normal skilled players. But now we're going to make that even more complicated by layering on the effects of a mass audience. Any competitive game, any PvP game is going to have a skill differential among players. If you're a small indie developer and you have a small player group, there's still going to be an enormous disparity in their ability to play your game. But League of Legends has about 100 million players, so that skill differential can get really large. Our bell curve has really long tails at both ends. And on top of that, we make our lives extra hard. He's saying the guy controlling the other 5 units almost won. Because in League, everyone plays by the same rules. This is different from, say, basketball, where the point lines will change depending whether you're at amateur, college, or pro play, or a game like golf, where there are different tee boxes that different players will use. This is important to us because there's a virtuous cycle in League of people viewing the game and then playing the game and wanting to view the game again. And by viewing, this could be eSports or streaming or any games players are watching on the internet. If you're a NASCAR fan, chances are good that you're not out racing cars on the weekends. I don't know, maybe some of you are, but most people, that's kind of a sport they participate in as viewers, not necessarily as participants. We think this is important because in League, players look to the pros to get better. If I'm trying to learn jungling, I might look at what are the kind of items that Bengi picks. He certainly knows what he's doing. And there's also this aspiration of the path to pro. It doesn't apply to me because I'm old and my reflexes are shot. But for younger players, they have this promise that if they just get good enough at League of Legends, they may make it to the big leagues and someone may pick them up for their esports team. As an aside, though, I just want to offer a counterexample that while messy, multiple rule sets do have some benefits. We get into situations sometimes as developers where the problems are really over-constrained. Like, we can't buff this unit for the high end because it's already too dominant, but players at the low end can't necessarily use it. I just want to throw that out there, that it's not necessarily cut and dry, that one rule set is the only way to go. So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking at a very tactical level about how Riot balances League of Legends with all of that in mind. This is the secret sauce. I'm going to try to be as frank as I can about what we do behind the scenes because that's why we all come to GDC, right? So first, we have a philosophy, and I really encourage you to get your studio, your team, your designers aligned on your goals and values. Not just as a development studio, but on individual projects as well. If you have a shared philosophy, it really helps to arbitrate the tough calls. You aren't debating, are we okay with this, kind of in the heat of the moment. You already know what good looks like, so then when you're missing that target, you can react. It also provides precedence for the teams of tomorrow. Game development tends to be a highly mobile career. People will leave studios or leave teams or move to different teams. And I feel like we spend a lot of our time doing archaeology, like trying to understand why did the developers who worked on this game 2 years ago make this particular decision. So if you have goals and values that you can particularly publish someplace and make sure the whole company understands, it can help to mitigate some of that. So for example, these are the League design values. I won't go through them all here, but we do make sure that the changes we make are aligned with these values. The idea is that hopefully we're making the game over time, we're making the game better over time rather than just doing this kind of one step forward, two step back thing where, oh, we made a change, oh, that was a bad change, let's make another change, oh, that was another bad change. I mean, don't get me wrong, that still happens for sure, but the intent is that we're making progress. And it's not just design values. Riot has values. League of Legends as a product has values. There are values for particular, very small project. It could be as narrow as, hey, we really need to nerf Leona's late game. And then once you have that philosophy, make sure you actually do stick with it. We really like to work this way because it helps to mitigate against designers tinkering. And by tinkering, I mean someone's driving into work and they're like, I had a crazy idea. Let's do this and see what happens. That could be fun as a designer. It's really pretty painful for players. And it also solves the mythical, oh, I had a bad game last night. Leona beat me, so I'm going to go in and make sure the team nerfs Leona. Players think we work that way. So instead, we're trying to solve specific problems like X is too strong in the laning phase, rather than, hey, something popped into my head out of the blue. Now, as an aside, Riot as a company really likes to work this way overall because it helps to empower our teams. It makes the growth of the company more scalable because instead of the same decision makers kind of having to swan dive into every single discussion that's going on, we can spend our time getting aligned on what the values are, and then the teams can go off and make the decisions themselves without having to like reopen every discussion because we've already kind of agreed on what the high-level goals are. But you won't always get it right. One of my leads the other day said, even the best design that you've really thought about and beat up probably has about a 70% chance of hitting your bullseye. So having a risk mitigation plan can help to avoid panic when that happens. You need good KPIs and key performance indicators. You need to understand what you're going for here. If you're nerfing a champion on League, do we want to see her drop rate go down by 2%? Are we worried players aren't playing this champion because they're too complicated, they don't understand the synergies between their abilities? When you have good KPIs, it helps that you can agree if you've missed your goals rather than debating, did we miss our goals or not? You immediately evaluate, okay, we missed our goals, and then you can enact the plan. For example, when we make a new champion, the champion designer might say, her weakness is supposed to be that she's not very strong in early lane. So if she ends up being a lane bully, nerf her Q, and that'll kind of skew her back towards the late game. Now, we do focus on a target. We aspire to balance for all players, but being able to focus helps us avoid insanity. And this is particularly relevant because we patch the game very frequently and don't always have a lot of time in between patches. We do look at outliers at all levels, but I'll kind of walk you through the sweet spot for game balance. So if you look at how many players the changes are impacting, imagine the bottom scale here is number of players in a particular tier. There's a lot of bronze players, fewer silver players, only a few dozen pro players in the world. And this other axis is sensitivity game changes. So if we change a champion's attack by 5, a newer player isn't even going to notice that. They're much better off just playing 10 more games. That will improve their win rate much more than anything that we're going to do in terms of balance. And then you can see the sweet spot here where these two curves intersect is right around high platinum, low diamond. That's kind of an area that we think we're impacting a lot of players still rather than the super rarefied air of the challenger, master, pro tiers. But we still do look for outliers at all level. If Garen or Master Yi is stomping bronze, we'll take action there. If there's a champion that's 100% pick ban at the pro level, we'll try to take action there as well. Now, players will assume that you should and do balance for high elo only. That's the important thing to a lot of players. They don't necessarily understand why you're making changes that will help out less experienced players. But this would remove a lot of the 130 champions from those players. We do have to constantly reinforce the goals of balance to all within the community. I'll watch prominent streamers discussing the state of balance in League, and they're always talking about, oh, well, now the pros are going to pick this or that. Why, what is Riot thinking here? A lot of this stuff is publishing. And by publishing, I mean the community, the messaging you're sending to your communities to make sure they understand what your goals are and why you're making the wacky changes to the game that you're making. Now, interestingly, pro balance itself is largely about viewers. We don't want to make life terrible for our pros, obviously, but when we make a change, it's often with the idea of our viewers having a fun time watching League of Legends. We will make changes if, for example, the game gets a little stale and viewers are saying, yeah, it's still fun to see the end game, but I skipped the first 20 minutes because it's really boring. That might lead us to make a change. In this case, balance could be fine, but we just think that we're going to hurt our virtuous cycle of viewing and playing and viewing if people start tuning out of eSports. I want to stress, again, this stuff is hard. You can't hand this to one guy at the end of the cycle as a part-time job. Believe me, I was that guy in Age of Empires. It doesn't work. Certainly not with the expectations for players these days. It really takes a dedicated team. And I realize that may be challenging if you're a smaller and indie dev, in which case I would say you're just going to have to leverage the feedback from your players a lot more. It's going to be hard for you to get tuning right. So if you ship your changes, listen to what players are saying, and then react to that. And I'll talk a little more, about that in a second. So the team structure for League of Legends, we have a dedicated live team. These are the men and women who are largely responsible for patch-to-patch balance. You could think of them like the first responders or the MASH unit. Someone is bleeding on the curb, they have to get out there and fix them. They deal with problems that can't wait for a holistic or systemic solution. They got to get in there right now and fix things. We patch every 2 weeks. Since you all are game developers, you understand that that doesn't mean they actually have 2 weeks to make changes. When you take into consideration things like build stability and QA testing and localization, often they have 3 days to decide something's amiss, make changes, test those changes, make additional changes, and then get it out there to players. Our live team is backed up by a playtest team of very skilled players. Many of these players are ex-pros. The playtest team is critical for us to get early impressions and data. You could think of it as like being able to deploy your patch early or having a beta even before your beta. I've been able to create a playtest team at all 3 studios where I've worked, at Ensemble, Blizzard, and now at Riot. It can be a hard sell when you're trying to convince the studio to hire, in this case, we need over 10 players to be able to play a 10-player game. But it's worth it when you consider that the designers in QA who are probably in the trenches can't play the game all day long. They have to actually sit at the computer and make changes as well. So without someone playing the game constantly, you may only get 2 or 3 games in during the day. Again, I understand for a small studio or an indie dev, this isn't going to be feasible. And as a warning, high elo players are going to suggest high elo changes. So you just have to keep that in mind when they're talking about, hey, I thought of a way to fix this. That's probably going to fix it for them and not necessarily all the rest of the skill tiers. Now, I talked about how we had a focused team, and we focus on a target elo, but we also have a focused target time. Just as with our professional game, ranked play in League follows a season. The ranked season turns on, players progress, and then at the end of the year it turns off. And we know that systemic changes, or even things like a new champion launch, we recently launched Camille, and her win rate did not hit our targets. We know these changes are going to compromise balance and disrupt the game for players. This past preseason, we made a massive change to the assassin characters in League of Legends. This not only involved individual champions, but their items, their masteries. We even changed the way stealth works, since stealth is really tied into assassin characters. And again, we do this deliberately, make these kind of disruptive changes knowing that it's worth it, but also knowing that balance will take a hit. And during these times, players are going to say, WTF, Riot, why is your balance team asleep at the wheel? When really, we've made life hard on the balance team by making all these other changes to the game. So we try to constrain the most disruptive changes to preseason and midseason. Messaging here is super important so that players understand what's going on and understand that, hey guys, things will be a little crazy for a while. We're putting plants in the game. We're trying a new pick ban system, whatever. We know that's going to come at a balance cost, and because we patch quickly, we're going to try to get things back to a stable place. Now, I have a few slides here on using data. We gather a lot of data. Riot has a really powerful insights team, and they help us to collect a lot of analytics about the game, and then help us to interpret that as well. I know I talk about win rate a lot. That is an important stat for us. We target a 50% win rate for champions at all skill tiers. But it's not the only stat, and it doesn't tell the entire story. The story here is that most players do not think that Yasuo is scary, funny, or cute, but they do think he is a badass, powerful, unique, and maybe beautiful in North America. So here's an example of win rate, but we're looking at win rate by skill level. So on the left of each of these curves is the bronze players, and at the right is kind of challenger master tier. You can see a champion like Veigar, hovers at around a 50% win rate. It does go down a little bit at high elo, but overall, we're pretty happy with that. That's not too bad. Whereas Twisted Fate here, if you are a bronze player, that's not a great champion choice for you. You're probably going to lose a lot, while as you climb in ELO, his win rate's going to get pretty respectable, borderline overpowered there at 55%. Next to him is Garen, who I talked about before, and you can see, just like I promised, his win rate goes down a lot as you get to the higher tiers of difficulty. And I also have Aatrox here, and the asterisk is because he appears to fall off a cliff and go down to a 40% win rate, which just wouldn't be acceptable. But what's really going on here is the sample size is very, very low. High-tier players just don't even play him a lot, so the data we're getting from that isn't awesome. And this is just an example of you have to really look at the data, not just make assumptions. Oh my god, his win rate is low, we have to buff. Similarly, here are the number of games on a champion, irrespective of ELO. You can see a character here like Aurelion Sol. Your first game of the Aurelion Sol, you may lose. In fact, you may lose a lot of games of the Aurelion Sol before you really understand what's going on with this champion. The far right on this slide could be 40 or 50 games, that's a pretty hefty commitment for a player. On the other end of the spectrum is a champion named Volibear. After you've played Volibear 2 or 3 times, you've probably seen about all that Volibear has to offer. This is not the sign of a really well-designed champion, and he's the kind that is up for an update at some point. Now, Aurelion Sol is not awesome either. That's a really steep skill curve. We would rather them be rather the win rate not be so low at the low end. This is why it's so important to interpret your data. If you're playing against a Lee Sin, a popular jungle champion, the player you're playing against may very well have 3 times the number of games that you do on that champion because it takes that long to get good at Lee Sin. So if he's showing up at all, you may be playing someone who really knows what they're doing. In this case, it's not that Lee Sin is overpowered, it's just you're playing against a very experienced player on that champion. This is why you have to look at things like win rate based on games played and win rate based on ELO to really understand what's going on. Here's another example. Pro champion choice has an immediate effect on the rest of the game. Once we see a pro player pick a champion, we know that Spike is immediately going to show up around the world. It's interesting. Part of it, I'm sure, is just, the pros are really, really skilled players. If they know that this champion's good, they're probably good. I also think it's players kind of hate to be accused of not being up to date. Sometimes I think players would prefer to be known for poor skill than to be known that they were uninformed. Everyone hates to be wrong about things. So when you see particularly silver, bronze, silver, gold players pick up these pro choices, it's going to be an ineffective choice for them because they're not going to be able to pull off the things that the pros can pull off. This is Froggen is known for picking Anivia. And speaking of Anivia, she's a great case study for why you need to use your judgment to make calls. We don't use machine learning to balance League of Legends. We hire people that can use their own experience as game designers and QA to help make these decisions. Anivia often turns up red flags where her win rate can be as high as 55%. Yet we think if we nerfed her, players would be like, why did you nerf Anivia? She's not a problem. And when we reflect on that, we agree with them. Like, she has reasonable strategic counterplay, meaning that you can counterpick her in champion select. And she has reasonable tactical counterplay, meaning that when you're actually out on the map playing, there are things you can do to avoid her spells. So is she balanced? The data says yes, but our gut says no. And this leads to another topic, which is that we don't share our data publicly. We didn't do this on World of Warcraft or Age of Empires either. The reason is we're scared that we end up dictating choices to players. If they see that a champion has a low win rate, they may just not play that champion. And really, we'd rather players just play League of Legends and have fun and not obsess about becoming armchair statisticians. On the other hand, as a developer, or as a player, it feels really flippant when the developer says, well, that's not what our secret data says, and we're not going to show you our secret data. It makes it very hard for a player to argue against it. And it's possible that we could provide context. We could say, look, yes, this item build looks good on paper, but that's only with a really strong team coordination that you may not have in solo queue. So I just want to present this as an ongoing discussion. We're not changing our stance on this immediately, but we do discuss it a lot internally, and maybe it'd be an interesting experiment. So when you detect a balance problem, how do you know what to change? In the case of League of Legends, it could be the champion, it could be the item, it could be the mastery. This is the pre-game system for League of Legends, similar to talents and WoW. Is it the strategy players are using right now? Is it the synergy with with the other champions on that team? This is an example of Poppy, this cute little Yordle with the big hammer. We recently updated Poppy. It's a really, objectively, it was a really good rework. Super happy with the way that came out. But her win rate did spike. And it spiked at the same time that we changed one of our masteries. This is Courage the Colossus, the green guy here. Courage the Colossus gives you a shield when you crowd control a champion, and Poppy has a lot of crowd control. She's already pretty tanky. With Courage the Colossus, she would get this shield and become even more tanky. It felt overpowered. We knew we needed to do something, and we debated a lot. Was Poppy the problem, or was Courage the Colossus the problem? We definitely needed to nerf Courage the Colossus. The question was, did we also need to nerf Poppy? We went back and looked at the data in this case, and we saw that her win rate had started to spike even before the Courage of the Colossus change. So in this case, we did change both. We nerfed both the mastery and the champion at the same time. And if we hadn't done that, we would have had to go in the next patch, and she still wouldn't have been fixed. I'm a big advocate of playtesting your own game. Having a playtest team, having a lot of data from players is no excuse not to play the game yourself. If you don't, you'll miss stuff. You won't really understand the player experience. Numbers just can't tell you the entire story. And sometimes it's going to be really obvious. You're like, oh, I understand the win rate of this champion. It's because nobody can tell what's going on with their spell visuals. They don't know if they're standing in the fire or not. On the other hand, I want to caution you not to go too far here in the other direction. It can be really easy to take your experience as a player and assume that applies to all players. And I definitely see this happen when, as a development team matures, meaning we're all getting older, it's easy for us to forget just how many games and how engaged some players can be with our games. So don't play one game and make a lot of balanced decisions based on that one game. This is, in fact, how we used to balance Age of Empires. We would go play a game, make tuning changes, go play another game, make tuning changes. Just doesn't fly, I think, anymore. I try to play League every day. I don't always succeed. I've been at GDC. Not playing a lot of League right now, but it does help to stay in touch with what players are talking about. So this is the best slide in the deck. I'll just give you a second here. I think the best thing is that he's just kind of, assuming it's a he, he's just kind of commenting. It's like, oh, I just noticed this. Kind of surprised me. No judgment call there. You do need to listen to players. We listen to our own forums, Reddit, Twitter, rioters who tell us they noticed something wrong, pros, streamers. I could give you an entire talk on leveraging player feedback. This doesn't mean always do immediately what the players are asking for. You'll often be really sad if you do that. But ignore them at your peril. They're giving you feedback. They want to see the game improved. You do need a good solution for other regions, other languages. And again, smaller studios may struggle more with this. Riot is fortunate enough that we have regional offices in all the countries where League is played, and we rely a lot on those teams to tell us, hey, did you know that players in Vietnam are talking about this, this problem in the game that may not have filtered out to other regions yet? And that helps us to kind of pay attention to what Vietnamese players are saying, because I certainly can't speak Vietnamese. Like many companies, we also use beta tests for the changes we're going to put out. Betas are really good for bugs, and they're really good for impressions. So a player may say, wow, this is complicated, or I'm not exactly sure how I'm supposed to be using that. In general, sweeping statement here, but in general, betas are not good for balance testing. And the reason is because players understandably don't try that hard. If they're going to devote 10 hours this week to your game, they probably want to spend time in the actual game, not on your beta realm, trying things out that may very well never get shipped, at the end of the day anyway. So you end up with smaller populations, which means matchmaking is not awesome, and so forth. I will add that on World of Warcraft, testing the PvE game, meaning dungeons and raids, worked pretty well on beta, and that's because the high-end raiding guilds would want to get a jump start on the content and practice. So in this case, practicing did actually work out for them. But the PvP balance feedback from World of Warcraft beta was about as not helpful as the balance feedback from League of Legends betas. I would also discourage you from trying things like, oh, well, we'll bribe players to play our beta. You may get a short-term spike in engagement, but overall, you have to be really careful to not like motivate odd behavior just because you want them to play a lot of games. We also just ask players. We don't necessarily wait for them to come to us. We do player labs where we bring players into the studio, have them play a game, then ask them about their experience. We do this a lot, say, for new champions or champion updates or crazy changes that we'd like to make to the game. We have a micro-survey tool that we leverage extensively. Anyone who's played League of Legends very long has probably gotten one of these surveys after a game asking, hey, did you like this change? What do you think about that? It's really interesting to look at how the survey feedback changes over time, how it changes in different regions around the world. This last preseason, we added plants to the Summoner's Rift map that players can interact with. There's somewhat of a random element to the way plants spawn, and when players first heard about this, they freaked out, and they thought, oh, we're adding too much RNG to League of Legends, it's going to ruin the game, this is, sky's falling. And nowadays, our surveys are showing that most players are pretty happy with the way plants ended up. So I'm not saying players are dumb by any stretch. I'm saying that we didn't necessarily set their expectations for what the feature was going to be. So now that you have goals, data, and player feedback, this is the basic iteration cycle that we use. Make changes, gather data, gather player feedback, make more changes. You may have to go through this cycle a few times. Let's take Nidalee, for example. Nidalee is a champion that can turn into a panther, which makes her very fast. She can also throw a spear. So guess what? Nidalee is our cavalry archer. And just as with the cavalry archers, we have trouble balancing her. So we'll make a change, doesn't fix the problem. Make another change, doesn't fix the problem, and so on and so on. Spoiler, she still isn't right. Sad Nidalee. Sometimes problems can't be solved through tuning. I mentioned before that the live team is like our first responders. They can get to the scene of an accident, but they can't fix like traffic patterns. They're not empowered to like rewire the stoplights to try to create fewer accidents overall. We do need sometimes to go through and make more systemic changes. We do this a lot through champion updates. Rise is kind of infamous here for a champion that we just can't get right. We'll make a change, we'll put him out. He still is too powerful at high elo, too weak at low elo. We'll make another change, and this goes on over and over. As a last resort, you can basement champions. We hate to do this because it feels like it's violating a lot of the player trust about being able to play the champions they want to play, but it's also not fair to players to give them a champion that is just going to ruin the experience for everyone. Azir is a very challenging champion for us to balance. It probably stems from the fact that he can do so many different things. He doesn't really have weaknesses that you can exploit. If we tried to tune him, given his current set of abilities, his win rate may be 60% at pro and 30% at bronze, which I'm probably exaggerating there, but he's definitely a hard to balance champion. He probably just needs an update and needs to lose some of what he can do. So winding down here a little bit, I've talked a ton about balance, but I want to stress that balance isn't everything. And as a systems designer, you can definitely fall into the trap of looking at everything through the lens of balance. Champions can be balanced, meaning their win rate could be perfect, but still really frustrating. And here are 3 examples: Riven, LeBlanc, and Yasuo. Yasuo's win rate may be totally fair, and enough players may think he's bullshit that they stop playing the game, which is not, as a developer, you don't want to say, but he's balanced. Likewise, remember that players pick champions for a lot of different reasons. I mentioned the pro example with Froggens and Nivea earlier. This is Jinx. She's a very popular champion to play. Her abilities are cool. Her thematic, she's kind of a anarchist riot girl, really resonates with players. We know that Jinx is always going to be popular. It's not necessarily because she's unbalanced, and in fact, right now, she's a little weak, if anything. If you look at her play rate and conclude, oh, people are playing her too much, we should nerf her, you're just going to make players sad. Being on a balanced team is hard. The balanced team is going to hear a lot about how terrible they are. Is LoL going to suffer the same fate as WoW because of Ghostcrawler? Burnout is really frequent. You're giving this team one tool to solve every problem. It's like, here's a wrench. No matter what happens, you have a wrench to solve it. Players and even coworkers are going to focus a lot more on failure than success. And there's never a break. As I said, we patch every 2 weeks. So as soon as the team is like, OK, we've made some changes for patch 7.5, now let's start patch 7.6. There's never really an off cycle. Some of the solutions we use are to offer side projects for folks on the team. So not everything is, can I buff or nerf 5 attack damage here? We also try to rotate folks off the team. That's good for their sanity, and it also helps to add some of the knowledge they've learned about balance to other teams as well. And finally, tell them they're doing good. They're going to hear a lot about how much they're screwing up. So it's great to reinforce with these guys how important their job is, because they're honestly not going to hear it often from players, even when they legitimately are doing well. So in conclusion, balance matters for longevity and engagement. I would encourage you to understand why certain factors affect balance at different skill levels. I would encourage you to have a philosophy. Don't just make changes based on data, but making changes checking against your goals. And iterate, 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 and follow through when you don't get something right. You're going to screw up a lot. I screw up a lot. Riot screws up a lot. Follow up when it does. Having a good relationship with your community will help. We work really hard on this because players will give us the benefit of the doubt when we do make a mistake. They won't doubt our intentions. They'll just doubt our competence a little bit. Good luck, and with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Hey. So when nerfing things, how do you mitigate the kind of feel bad effects of loss aversion? Is that do you actually take that into account in making your design decisions, or is that mostly a PR community management thing?
I mean, it is a community management thing, but we involve the people making the changes as well. I think that's a very real concern, and I think as developers, we don't always pay enough attention to it. It's really easy to focus, again, on let's make that 50% number show up for every champion, and to forget how it's going to feel for players. One thing to avoid is the Nidalee example, where you make a change, you don't quite hit it right, so the next patch, there's another nerf, and the next patch, there's another nerf. That starts to feel really bad for players. They know every time they're going to open up patch notes, they're going to see a nerf. Yes. I would encourage you in those cases to make sure you get it right if you've tried a few times, or let it ride for a little bit, kind of let them recover. We also work really hard on our patch notes to provide context. Look, it's not that we hate Nidalee, it's that we're trying to solve this particular problem. I also think Riot, like many studios, is a little too quick to nerf and a little slow to buff. I mean, nerfing is much easier than buffing, but when you offset that a little bit, it doesn't, it's not as negative experience overall. It's a great question.
Hi, you mentioned, sorry, I'm stealing the microphone, thanks. You mentioned basementing?
Yes.
What does that mean? Can you explain that? That
means your champion is such a problem in the game that the only thing to do is just nerf the crap out of them so that players aren't going to play them. Players who love that champion will play them. They'll probably still show up in lower tiers. It's a really shitty thing to do, particularly for players who love that champion. But it's hard to justify having that character in the game ruining the experience for everyone else just so the players that love that champion can do it.
Quick follow-up. How do you handle messaging around that? Is there a strategy there, or do you just do it quietly and hope people keep quiet?
My general policy is to be as honest with players as you can. They're smart. They're going to figure it out. They're not going to buy your bullshit excuse. So in those cases, I would say, look, we screwed up. We can't make this character or unit or whatever game you're working on. We can't make this healthy right now. We're going to temporarily kind of park them, and we are going to get back to it. You do need to follow up. You just can't leave them in that state forever. We did that once with a champion named Olaf, and players still call it Olafing as the verb.
Thanks.
Hi, great talk. I have a question about the amount of champions you have, and as the meta progresses, some of them will be underrepresented. So when you're doing updates like buffs and nerfs, do you usually look at the underrepresented champions and buff them so that they could be more relevant? We look at champions who have a lower win rate and try to buff them to stay relevant, assuming that we can do so in a healthy way. Galio is a champion we're working on right now. His abilities just aren't that exciting. Volibear is another example. So we'd be hesitant to buff them excessively. We don't buff champions just based on low play rate. We have champions like Urgot. He's a creepy dude. We don't necessarily want to see Urgot as popular as Jinx. That's part of why players like to play him, is he's a little weird. So in that case, we're fine as long as there are players out there that love that champion. All right, thank you.
You talked a lot about how higher play rate on a champion. So for example, if a player plays a champion a lot, their skill will increase with that champion. So if you take this and you add it to the fact that there's 130 champions and only 6 bans for ranked online, it seems as if you're encouraging one tricks. Is that intentional, or is that kind of a side effect of?
It's a side effect, and I hate it, and I think it's one of the biggest design challenges we have to fix with League of Legends overall. If you ask a skilled player, how do I get better at ranked? They'll tell you, be a one-trick pony. Find one champion, play the hell out of that champion, know everything there is to know about that champion. And that is effective, and you will increase your win rate and probably the tier you play in. Unfortunately, it leaves a huge variety of the game unavailable to you. We try to offer all these champions for a lot of diversity. In fact, we know that people who play more champions tend to stick with the game longer and say that they're having more fun. You can imagine burnout is probably higher when you've played 300 games with Vi. You can imagine that when Vi gets nerfed, you may just churn out of the game rather than switching to another champion. So I don't have good solutions to that. It keeps me up at night for sure.
Okay, thank you.
So I had a question revolving around champion tiering, which is just like this sort of construct that like other players have sort of constructed to say these champions are tier 1, these champions are tier 2, which basically represents like pick these first and these guys are niche and these guys are useless. Mm-hmm. Do you embrace champion tiering and say like we're building this guy to be tier 1 and this other guy is some really niche counter and that's okay and he's not going to be high pick? Like, I guess it revolves around, are you striving for even pick rates or do you sort of embrace the tiers?
No, we don't strive for even pick rates. There are champions that are really good at particular things. Shen is a good split pusher. If you don't enjoy split pushing or that strategy currently isn't super powerful in the game, he may not be a great pick. We want that a player who loves a champion to have opportunities to play them. It feels terrible if you love this champion, you've invested a lot in them, maybe you've spent a lot of money on skins for this champion, and now you feel like you just can't play them. That's a really terrible experience.
And then I had a request from another gentleman to go back to the conclusions page. I think he wanted to take some notes.
There we go.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey.
You talked about not only having a philosophy, but following it. I'm wondering if you can give some example actions of what you've done to incorporate your philosophy into your team so it's actually part of the culture.
We talk a lot about it, for starters. I make sure that we reinforce with the team. We give teams a lot of autonomy at Riot, and so then when someone makes a mistake, we'll retro it and we'll talk about it. Like, did we make this change to this champion because we really thought players would embrace it, or did we make this change to the champion because you thought it was fun as a designer? I mean, sometimes good things come out of that, but again, I feel like it's not super fair to players to just use them as our playground like that. So we retro things, we talk about what went wrong. We try not to beat up our teams too much for mistakes unless there's kind of a repeated pattern of making the same mistakes and not learning from that.
So is it really kind of on the onus of the leadership team to like make sure they're hitting those talking points then?
Yeah, absolutely. I describe my job a lot. Like, I do not balance League of Legends. You wouldn't want me to. It would be a travesty. What I do is I talk more about creating an ecosystem in which good design decisions get made. So I try to make sure people are thinking about things in frameworks, and then that frankly we just hire good people and smart designers and try to make sure they're aligned with our high-level values, and then turn them loose and get out of their way.
Thank you.
First, thank you for your inspiring presentation. I'd like to ask about the balancing of champions in several stages. Like, for example, you nerf one of them, you see that it's not enough, or it's over the edge, and the next iteration you buff it a lot. So which way do you prefer? Do you take one champion, apply some changes, and then let it sit for a while and come to it later, well, a lot later probably? Or do you try to iterate in successful succession patches until he's perfect?
It really depends on the situation. As I mentioned a little bit ago, I caution you not to nerf the same character over and over again. I mean, this happened on World of Warcraft as well, where we couldn't quite solve a problem, and so patch after patch, there's another, Feral Druid nerf or whatever. Nerfing tends to be easier than buffing, particularly when you're looking at a situation where we have 10 champions that are okay and one outlier, and players are always like, well, why don't you buff the other 9 to be equal to that win rate? That's just a lot harder to do. If you keep missing the mark, you need to step back and understand why are you missing the mark. Is your data collection flawed? Are you just changing the wrong thing? Are players adjusting as quickly as you can? Sometimes it does help just to step back and see what happens. It can take the community a while to develop a counter strategy to a dominant strategy. We do try to, we describe our relationship to League's balance as curation. Like Riot doesn't kind of let it out in the wild and then whatever happens, happens. We do try to step in when players are experiencing too much pain.
Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to get some more of your thoughts on the relationship between viewership and changes. Like one contrast to traditional sports like soccer, there's no balance changes to the game. It hardly ever evolves. But on the eSports side, every time you're making a change, the balance change. I know you mentioned that you do keep viewership into account, but how much relationship is there? Do people? Is there a risk of them getting out of touch with the game and then not understanding what they're watching?
Yeah, absolutely. We do. We have to take that into consideration when we make changes. We know that the changes we make are going to affect the pros. One of the things we try to do is keep them in the loop, like as part of the discussion, like, hey guys, just want to let you know, we're thinking about making this change, what's your reaction? We don't let them balance the game for us, but we do want to get their feedback, because they're very in touch with that. We also know that making systemic changes, like, for example, not that long ago we changed the dragon in League of Legends to actually be 5 different dragons that kind of spawn at random. We rely a lot on our casters and analysts to help explain this to viewers. We have, Riot is blessed with very exceptional talent there, and they can kind of help bring players along on that journey to understand what's going on. It's a very complicated game.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello. I wanted to ask about if an AI-controlled champion being good in high elo and low elo, like how would you balance that out if it's very popular on the low elo?
It's challenging. We have a champion named Ivern, who's like a happy tree guy, who has an AI, a boulder creature named Daisy, and he's been pretty popular, pretty high win rate recently despite the AI. I think that's because not that much of his power budget is tied up in the AI. He can do a lot of cool things in addition to that. So if you want to have a champion that uses a lot, a character in your game that uses a lot of turrets or AI, I would say just make sure that the power budget is pretty small there.
Okay.
I think we have about 3 minutes left. If we run out of time, I'm going to go over to the wrap-up room, which is right by the escalators to the left.
Different countries have different preferences and aesthetic choices and champions they might choose. How does that play into how you decide? Because different countries have different play style choices as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Overall, we've found that players are players, and if a champion is cool in one region, it tends to be popular in other regions as well. There are definitely regional differences. Chinese players love big guys with swords. We probably couldn't make enough big guys with swords. A character like Jinx, who's like this anarchist rebel, that archetype just doesn't resonate as much historically in their culture as it does, say, in the West. And that's fine. We know there's going to be regional differences. Some places are going to embrace a champion more than others. We try to offer a diversity there. We do have 130, so hopefully there'll be something for everyone.
But do you actually make any choices saying this country may like this aesthetic and we want them to maybe try different play styles, so we're going to actually give them this aesthetic with a varying play style?
One strategy we use that can help there are the champion skins, which change the look and sometimes the voice of a champion quite a bit. So we can introduce a champion or a line of skins that has to do with a holiday or a historical event in some country, knowing that they may not have widespread appeal, but those players are going to love it.
Cheers.
How do you feel about players and fan sites gathering and sharing data in order to help each other to play the game?
That's a really good question. Overall, I don't begrudge them from doing that. It totally makes sense why players want that information, particularly given that we don't provide it. The challenge is that sometimes the data is wrong. And in those cases, as developers, we don't have the bandwidth to go debug it and explain to players why it's wrong. So we end up just kind of waving our hands and say, oh yeah, that data's bad. And then players are left scratching their heads. This is why we're talking a lot about, does it just make sense to offer the information out there? For example, a lot of the fan sites that offer data on League only look at high platinum, which is not going to tell you the whole story because very few of us are high platinum. All right, maybe time for one more question. Are we good? All right, thank you very much.